Hello, everyone. Thank you for being a part of this evening's webinar. This is Microdynamics 3, Planting, Tending, Harvesting by the Moon and with the Biodynamic calendar with our presenter, Stewart Lundy. And my name is Rafael Guzman. I am a staff member here with the Biodynamic Association. And before I turn over the presentation to Stewart, I'm just going to go over a couple things to ensure that everyone's feeling a little comfortable with Zoom if you haven't used it before, and just how we use it in our webinars to ensure best quality of experience for everyone. So to start off with, for sound quality, we do ask that all participants stay muted for the sound quality of the recording, as the webinar will be recorded and available to you after the session. And with that, for questions and asking to speak up in our session, there are two different options. There's one option to raise your hand, and there's also our chat box, which I see there's been some exchange already in. And to find both those features, what you would do is take your cursor and hover over the bottom bar of the Zoom screen. And first you'll see a silhouette of two figures that says participants. And if you move over, if you click on that, to your right, you'll get a pop-up. And at the bottom of that pop-up, there'll be an option to raise and lower your hand, mute and unmute yourself. And that's an option to indicate that you have a question to share or would like a little clarity on something that has been shared. Another option is to put a question in the chat. And that's, again, at the bottom of the screen, a little bubble icon with 3 dots. And if you click on that, you can just either write a note to myself or Stewart directly, or to the group as a whole, or perhaps to another person in the group if you know them and want to say hello. For those of you joining us by phone, to raise your hand, you'll press *9 on your touch screen, and *9 again to lower your hand, and then it will be *6 to mute and unmute yourself. If you're having any connection issue and the audio is coming through jumpy, the first point to check in with is to turn your video off, and that will boost your available bandwidth for the audio. If it is a persistent problem, another option is to just turn off Zoom completely. It doesn't affect the recording or any of our experience in the session, but from there you can enter in again, and sometimes that alleviates any of the network challenges. And of course, if that's not working, please feel free to call in. The phone numbers are in the email that was sent out earlier. All right. Let's see, does anyone have any questions regarding the Zoom feature at this time? Not seeing any raised hands or hearing any voices. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Stewart. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Stewart Lundy. I'm in Accomack, Virginia. We're here on the eastern shore of Virginia. We've got a mixed homestead. We run about 40 acres. We've got a market garden. Well, used to be a market garden before this year. This year, we've had to shift over at the very last minute to a CSA, and that's been interesting. Actually, today was our first drop-off and delivery, and it went off without us making mistakes. So we did have someone pick up a CSA share when they were supposed to have received it at their home. So that messed things up a little bit. It was exciting, but yeah, sometimes you have to harvest regardless of the phase of the moon and regardless of what the calendar says, because Tuesday comes around and that's when people want their CSA share. But as much as possible, we really do try to tend according to the moon. We even take some of the outer planets into consideration, but we predominantly pay attention to the moon. And really, if you look at the biodynamic calendars, I like to use Maria. And I also like Stella Natura's. If you look at those, you're really tracking mostly the patterns of the moon. So this comes down to this older view that nothing was disconnected. If you were to travel back in time and see the world through the eyes of someone else, you would have looked out into space, and instead of seeing a chasm opening up full of emptiness, you would have actually seen, like, it would have felt like structured pillars extending into the heavens. We wouldn't have felt alone, because for them it felt like the surface of a cathedral, and sometimes you'll see the painted stars on the top of these cathedrals. For them, the world was structured, there was meaning to it, and everything was connected. And we've lost a bit of a sense of that, though you can see through various movements that we're coming back to that. Well, ultimately, any kind of farming or gardening, you're collecting sunlight. We're always prejudiced towards our closest star, the sun, because it's closest to us, and that's how people tend to be. But really, plants are pretty indiscriminate. They will photosynthesize out of all starlight. So really, when you think about farming or gardening, we're really collecting starlight. And it's this kind of deep interconnectivity that is the basis of biodynamics, but it's also kind of the context of what the calendar can mean and how to use it. We're going to explore some pretty far-reaching themes here in order to get a better idea of why to use the calendar and how to use the calendar. And in some ways, we almost have to go back to the beginning of the universe. As strange as that might seem, we have to take the macrocosmic view in order to focus on a microdynamic application. Here's a quote I'd like to share from D.H. Lawrence that I'll read out loud for anyone witnessing this in the future. "The cosmos is a vast living body of which we are still parts. The sun is a great heart whose tremors run through our smallest veins. The moon is a great nerve center from which we quiver forever. Who knows the power that Saturn has over us, or Venus? But it is a vital power, rippling exquisitely through us all the time." And that's from D.H. Lawrence's Apocalypse. It's this old idea of the planets influencing Earth, or you could almost look at it in a different way, that the planets themselves are an expression of, whether you want to think it mathematically, of a formula, a pattern, a gesture, a spiritual impulse, but that the planet Mars expresses a particular impulse as seen in the heavens. If you notice Mars astronomically, Mars will stand overhead for a year and then fall to the horizon the second year. And that's why, generally speaking, you could say that biennials, particularly like caneberries, are governed by Mars. They grow up for 1 year and then they fall to the horizon the second year. And it's looking for these inner kinships. And you could say that the planet Mars has no particular direct influence on the plant itself. It's that instead, they're both expressions of the same impulse that we name Mars when it's a planet. The same thing on Earth you see expressed differently. You see the same sort of, you could say, geometrical pattern. It's almost mathematical in its precision, this falling to the horizon. You can see this kinship, and that's what we're working with when we start to approach the calendar. Ultimately, every planet that you look at, whether it's the moon, Saturn, Venus, Mars, every planet is ultimately influencing us by a kind of reflected sunlight. The sun really is the heart of our solar system. So we can't ignore the sun. And that's where, if you look at the biodynamic calendars, and hopefully some of you have them with you, if you look today and you look up April 2020, if I can find it, and you will see, and I'll try to show you, you will see at April 2020, you'll see the solar aspect, and you'll see what sun sign the sun is in. And for us, at least when you consider it sidereally, I'm trying to erase it, the sun is in Aries, according to this. And you can also look for, well, what's the moon in? And you follow it down, and then you see the moon over here, then it is in Gemini. There are two ways of calculating the pattern of the stars, and one is to look at it in terms of where the physical position of the sun and moon are with really geometrical precision, and that's called sidereal. And then there's the other form that's used in Western astrology, which is called tropical. And that's basically an old version from Ptolemy, and that's a very old way of looking at it, which really hasn't caught up to where the stars actually are and where the planets actually are. When it comes to biodynamics, we're looking at the actual physical location of the different planets and their backdrop against the stars. We're not looking at the tropical zodiac, which is really more of a calendar because it deals with more seasons of the year, and it's one that's based on 2,000 years ago. Just a second. It sounds like someone's on. Can that possibly be muted? It's
All right, I think we're good.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Since we have to talk about the sun. We're always talking about the stars when it comes to the calendar. We have to talk about the sun in all of its aspects and relationships to the earth. Traditionally, we look at this through the lens of the zodiac. When the sun moves from one zodiac sign to another, it gains a different character. And this doesn't have to be woo. It doesn't have to be nonsense. You can look at it in a concrete way that the sun and the sunlight, the hours of the day, even the angle of the light, all of that shifts. And therefore, the character of the sun shifts through the year. You can certainly see the difference in terms of plant growth. The low sun in the winter is very different in terms of quality versus the sun midsummer. I found a solar graph, which I'd like to share with you here. This is, I have to give due credit, this is by Sam Corwall, who did these pinhole cameras and traced the path of the sun every week. As you can see, the sun at the lowest is radically different from the one at the highest. They're just simply not the same thing at all. And to talk about sunlight indiscriminately as always being sunlight really doesn't do this being justice. I'd like to share a quote here from Rudolf Steiner himself that addresses it. No one realizes what a specialized being the sun really is. It is not the same sun throughout the year. The sun shining from Taurus is not the same when it shines from Cancer. It is actually nonsense, but you can forgive me speaking of the sun in a general sense. We should almost say Aries sun, Taurus sun, Cancer sun, Leo sun, and so on. In a way, there are 12 suns. Each has a completely different character depending on the combined effect of the daily course of the sun with its course through the year, which are determined by the relation of the sun to the equinoxes. When you have to pay not just a sensitivity to your climate, which of course matters, but to the position of the sun, because certain things will not want to germinate and will certainly not want to thrive if you start them under the Leo sun, which is a very different thing if you start them from under a Virgo sun, even though that seems to be so close together in terms of time. But it's this cosmic backdrop which has to be the lens through which we look at these biodynamic calendars, or even considering planting by the moon. Because if we don't know the difference between one sun and another, it doesn't matter if we look at a calendar, because then it's like reading out of a recipe book. There's no personal relationship with that. There's no sensitivity to who that sun is at that time. And since the moon is largely reflecting the light of that sun, it's hard to know who the moon is unless we first know who that sun is. Because regardless of what sign the moon is in any particular month, it is reflecting the light of that sun. It's reflecting the light of a Leo sun, or in our case, Aries sun, which gives the moon a particular character, particular flavor during that entire month. So you can't simply look at the calendar as the moon is in Aries, the moon is in Virgo, and see that as being the same moon in Aries throughout the year. You could actually go so far as to say that certain times of the year, the moon does not behave the same way at all. If you look at Callisto's research in terms of full moon versus new moon, she actually found that come midsummer, particularly in August, she found that the full moon and the new moon both expressed characteristics of a full moon, versus in midwinter, she found that the full moon and the new moon both express characteristics of a new moon. So you still end up with the cosmic effect of 12 moons. The difference is that they're a little shifted about. They're not as dogmatic or literal as we like to think. This is an animation that I put together based on one of Robert Flood's diagrams. And you could tell from how he drew it, it was meant to be animated, even though he obviously didn't have multiple frames. Here we see there's fluid within the earth. And when the sun moves to one side, like to the left now, and then moves to the equinox, and then to the right, you get Easter, you get summer, you get winter. During winter, the soil fills up with moisture. During the summer, that moisture level declines or is almost evaporated through the plants. And knowing that difference really makes us have to consider how to govern the biodynamic calendar in a much more nuanced way. When Steiner talks about burying the biodynamic preparations over winter, he says that's when the earth becomes more alive. And that's really what we need to think about. He says it dies a bit in the winter. And in that sense, yes, it loses its water. The entire farm or garden as an organism, if you were to take all of the physicality away from it, imagine taking the animals away, but leaving the flowing water of those animals. Imagine taking the plants away, but just seeing this ghostly image of the water evaporating up through the plants and steaming out through transpiration through their ghostly leaves. You would end up seeing an image of the farm itself as a kind of plant that needs water, but then in a very regulated way distills it and refines it out and expresses itself literally and concretely to sense perception as flowers. But the farm itself also has this rarefied scent on the astral plane, which influences the neighboring region, not just itself. Here's a very interesting thought. And this was something I'd hoped to get into in my last microdynamics class. Did anybody else get a chance to either be present for that or see it? This is something I wasn't actually able to engage. This in particular is a photograph from the Sosterhausen estate in Silesia in 1937. And this is taking beet seeds and pre-treating them in a stag bladder, the same way that you would hang yarrow, in order to give it the full summer influence of hanging, ripening almost like a fruit, and then bearing over winter. And this is the results they got. They considered these to be quite large. Now, fodder beets in general, depending on what they were growing, can be enormous. And I would need to see more of a crop yield to see the whole influence. But these are huge. Even for fodder beets, they're quite large. But part of this gets to understanding where the sun is and who the sun is during the seasons. In this case, we know what kind of sun it experienced over summer, and then it continues for basically a full year it's experiencing these suns. But during the winter, it's able to charge. There are many ways of doing this. But this quote from Rudolf Steiner, it gets into the nitty-gritty of how that charging happens and why you would bury seeds at all. He says here, the plant seeds come together with the powers of destruction that exist in the dead body, and their powers are actually preserved. They will then be as active as fresh grain, even after a very long time. This here is referencing seeds that were taken from Egyptian tombs, where you have an ancient seed, which by all accounts should have decomposed, should have been rendered useless. But because of the presence of a slowly decaying body, that radiating energy continues to charge the seeds. That image and that principle gets back to why you would bury seeds over the 12 holy nights, or why you could even take seeds, put them in a glass jar, sink them into a compost pile, and that too would energize them, because it is collecting the radiant energy around them and increases that. All right. Someone's asking a question, and let me see. Could you please explain the bottom line of each month's page that lists the plants? I'm assuming the question means planets. At the bottom of each calendar, you can see here, there's a list of planets together with different signs. This just tells you what planet is in what sign. So here you see Mercury, it's in Sagittarius, moving into Capricorn. I will say for the most part, you can ignore these for now. This is more advanced stuff. You can get into it gradually, but I wouldn't jump into this. I remember when I first got the biodynamic calendar, that was pretty overwhelming to see all of those markings at the bottom. But for the most part, you're going to pay attention to these pretty colors, and particularly to this green bar, which I'll get more into in a little bit. I hope that answers that question a little bit. Again, that part at the bottom, and including all these sketches on these lines, you're probably not going to want to pay attention to right away. We want to start with our nearest celestial body, the moon. That is the most concrete, it has the loudest influence, and the moon is what's governing these reproductive plant processes. So that's what we're going to focus on most, and I hope that addresses that question. This is a varying technique. If you've seen this, you'll see these little frost crystals come out of the earth, particularly when there's this transition. I tend to see these in January, and you'll see them come up out of the earth, which is a very particular thing. The whole earth hasn't thawed, obviously, because they're forcing these ice crystals up and out. When that happens, and you're still getting thaws, so it has to create these crystals that stick out of the ground, and then it melts and goes back into the soil. As water thaws from ice, or as it cools from another temperature, it contracts. So there's something old timers would call frost seeding. And this is I'll write that down for you guys. That's frost seeding. As the ice melts on the surface, it will actually pull seeds down into the ground. So you can sow cover crop seeds this way without having a tractor if you know how to time this. Those ice crystals must thaw, or it will not pull it into the soil. It will just be food for the birds over winter, which is great as far as it goes. May not improve your soil the way you intended. But this is also a technique that can be used to apply the preparations at particular times of the year. And it's being sensitive to what the meaning of these times is and how to use that. But you can use that to cause the biodynamic preparations to contract into the soil, which is a pretty cool way to get it down deeper. So it's not on the surface where the UV burn it off, but instead is right there where you need it. There's something that we need to consider when it comes to the character of this sun. This is a diagram from Lily Kalisko's Agriculture of Tomorrow. And I'm going to show you 3 slides from that. She found that the character of every day was evenly divided into 12s. There were 12 night hours and there were 12 day hours, regardless of the length of the day. And what this means is that if you're at an equinox, that's pretty tidy because you have equal sunlight and you have equal nighttime. So every hour is literally 60 minutes. But if you're in the winter, you divide all your daylight hours into 12. And the kind of work that you want to get done, you need to consider where these hours are. And some people have said, I'd say rather abstractly, to apply preparations after 3 p.m. But, well, what's 3 p.m. on any given day? It really depends. If I apply a preparation after 3 p.m., Over here, you can see the day is already cooling, the atmosphere is right, the sun is already descending. If you do it at this time, yeah, sure, you can get it to work, and that contraction and cooling of the soil will pull the preparations in. And if you go even further to full summer instead of the equinox, you can see 3 p.m. is not enough here. You need it down here where the shadows are beginning to be cast over the garden. And this relativity of hours is actually a much older idea. It's actually a Jewish concept, and it's based on the halal hours in the Jewish tradition. Every hour is not simply an hour. So when you consider what time of day to do something, dawn, fortunately, we understand in biodynamics is relative. Sundown, we understand is relative. But if we get too hung up on thinking that every day is the same and that there's a 3 p.m. that corresponds all through the year, we're going to have a hard time using these calendars. I'm going to have to go back to the beginning of our universe, at least the beginning of our moon. If we want to talk in terms of how to use, oh yeah, sundials, there you go. If you want to talk about how to use the biodynamic calendar, we have to talk about, well, why does the moon have any relationship at all to plant processes, particularly to water? There's this concept coming out in modern science now, which has no particular relationship to anthroposophy or biodynamics, but corroborates Steiner's conception of where our moon comes from. And it's this idea of a synestia. Some people have theorized that something hit Earth and then that splintered off and created our moon. But this theory posits that the moon is made out of the same stuff as our Earth. And the latest research in terms of moon rocks has discovered that it has the same isotopes as Earth, which means it has the same signature. So if you were to find carbon on one planet versus carbon on our planet, they each have a different signature. So you can tell when something is from Mars versus something from Earth. The moon, all of it matches ours, which means that whenever they were formed together at the same time from the same source. A synestia is caused by a gigantic impact. And instead of forming a supernova, or instead of forming disks, like rings like Saturn, a sort of donut shape kind of forms, which is where they're not quite differentiated, but you can see the beginnings of the moon as we know it start to form in this belt. And they've been able to simulate this, which is really exciting stuff. And here's a quote from Steiner. If you happen to apply any fertilization under a new moon instead of a full moon, it waits in the earth until the next full moon and kindly ignores the human error. It's quite enough for people to use the moon without ever even knowing it. But without conscientious use of the moon's forces, you won't get much further than that. Steiner even goes so far as to say if you plant a seed in the ground, it will wait until the full moon to germinate. You can try some experiments with this, particularly with fast germinating seeds. Radishes are a really good result for that. And you will see that sometimes there's a delay in germination. Like for me personally, when you get to choosing what sign the moon should be in, what's the moment when the seed receives that new imprint? Is it the moment you stick it in the ground? Is it the moment it receives water in the ground? Or is it the moment of germination where that new life enters that organism? The trouble with that conception is that we don't exactly know the moment when something is going to germinate without careful observation. For example, barley, if you're growing it as fodder, germinates overnight, very quickly. You have something like corn, which can take many days before it actually opens up and awakens to that new impulse. You take something like parsnips, it can take considerably longer. So in theory, you could start something under an earth sign, yet not have it receive the new cosmic imprint until much later. So when it comes to planting with the biodynamic calendar, I tend to emphasize more tending under the certain sign that you want, the fullest expression of, because every plant needs every part. If you had a plant that was pure root, it would be a parasitic plant that wouldn't photosynthesize and would have to live off the sugars of neighboring plants. So we never want a plant that is extremely one-sided. They need all of the elements working together in concert. So when I start seeds, I feel like I can start them invariably on a root day, but then I like to tend them as much as I can towards the aspect that I want. So for example, if you're doing tomatoes, I'm comfortable planting them under a fruit day or under a root day. That gives me a lot more wiggle room throughout the month than if I were doing it only on a fruit sign. I know Maria Toon's research indicates that tomatoes do best exclusively tended under fire signs, though I've found that every plant starts with the root. So I've had pretty good results with that. For me, the calendar is cumulative. That does not mean that you've ruined a plant just because you planted it on the wrong time or you harvested part on the wrong time or you only had free time to tend it on the wrong sign. It's cumulative. It's about the intention and the tending of the plant. So if you're weeding a plant, you want to weed it on the whatever you're favoring. So like, let's say you're doing eggplant, you want to tend that on a fruit day. Even if you're weeding it, even if you're hoeing it, if you're watering it even, you want it to be emphasizing the aspect you want to eat. But like I said, a plant needs all of these aspects. So sticking to a one-sided approach, both is very difficult. And in the end, I don't know that it would be entirely beneficial to the plants themselves. When we explore this idea of the moon, we have to get back to a time when the Earth looked like this. The Earth had exploded and turned into this cloud. You can even see the fascinating thing of this. This is almost what Steiner would have perhaps referred to as old moon. This is a state when the moon had not yet differentiated itself from the Earth, but you can see it's beginning to form accretions here, and this is the beginning of the moon that's orbiting through here. There is a radius here and something spinning, but it's beginning to develop its own independent life. Right now during this, there's torrential rains, and you can see even in modern conceptions of this, the moon belongs with rain. As this contracted, we started to get a smaller version, and the kind of proto-moon evolved within this. But you can see at this point, the Earth itself is vaporized. It's liquid, it's gaseous, it's extremely hot, molten. When you hear Steiner talk about when the Earth was still liquid, liquid more accurately from our perspective would be molten, like lava. Like this stuff is super hot, hot to a degree we can't even imagine. The things that were hard then are not the same as the ones that are hard now. Basically, if you change the temperature and the pH enough and the pressure, physics totally changes once you get into the astrophysics level, and that's what you're dealing with here. As this contracted, we finally get the moon as a separate entity when it leaves the synestia, and this finally condenses into what we know as our Earth. It's on this basis that the Earth and the moon belong together, how the moon becomes tidally locked, always facing the Earth, but also how there's still this intimation of this watery process that crystallized into the moon, which is, incidentally, mostly silica. Steiner says when you look at a full moon or a new moon, you can discount it once it's past a certain stage, once it reaches a crescent. He really says it's about 50-50. So anything waxing towards the full moon counts as a full moon in his mind, generally speaking, and anything waning at the end towards the new moon counts as that. A nice little shorthand way of remembering which moon is which, whether it's waxing or waning, is that if you hold up your right hand, like this. Right hand may look different for you, but if you hold up your right hand and you're able to put it up against the moon, that is waxing. If you're able to put your left hand, that's waning. So wax on, wax off. That's a very helpful way to see what's happening. As the moon is waxing, you will get the strongest influence for germination, as Steiner indicated. And that's where it's important to be sensitive to that period on the calendar. For those of you who are looking at it, you'll see different aspects of the moon. And when the moon is waxing, particularly the 48 hours leading up to it, you will see some of the fastest germination rate on the biodynamic calendar, which you should be quite attentive to, because even if you don't pay attention to it, you're going to end up germinating based on that, because like Steiner said, the plants themselves will wait, even if you don't. All right. I'm going to show you some more about the waxing, waning, and the patterns of the moon that some people have asked about already. So here is an example of waning moon. Again, you can put your left hand up against the screen here. As it's waning, you will see it disappear to your left, and that's a very useful hand to use. And then you get to your new moon. Once you've reached the new moon, it's a very different state. It's not going to be as stimulating as the full moon with its ripening, fructifying effects, but in some ways it's a more stabilizing dry effect. It doesn't stimulate those lunar growth and reproductive forces as much as the full moon. If we continue on, we'll see it wax. Again, you can use your right hand now, and that develops outwards. This is a good way to use the calendar, and the irony, of course, of using a calendar is that sometimes the best way to use it is to not use it. Is instead to look to the moon, see what it is doing, observe the plants and see how they grow under its influence. And you're going to start noticing things that they're not printed in the books. And I can't even get into them right now, but you're going to notice that the moon does have its own peculiar character that sometimes doesn't always agree with the calendars. And it's not that there's any fault to the calendars at all. In fact, if you were to look at some of Alex Polinsky's remark on Maria Thune's research, he indicated that if it had been done anywhere other than where she was, and where she was, his claim is that Maria Thune's research was done at the center of 12 Druid zodiac sites. There were mounds around the farm where she did her research, wherein she could have a balanced, equal influence from all zodiac signs. Whereas if you move somewhere else, like say where I am, you're going to get a much more humid climate, so the moon becomes more prominent. Whereas if you end up somewhere that's drier, the moon may be a little more subdued, and yet you get more of the outer planet influence that's able to cut straight through and influence directly by its radiation. So you're going to find me working from a lunar area, low altitude, high humidity, a lot of water. I'm going to be talking about the moon a lot because that's the way I have to use this. You may find that you will talk more about the sun if you're in a warmer area, hotter area, a higher altitude. All of this is very different depending on where you are. And over time, you'll find you're developing a personal calendar, one that teases out and expresses the fullest relationship you can with these planets, yourself, and the land. So for me, a lot of this has to center on the moon because there's so much water. I'm dealing with its excesses all the time. If we continue, this is a diagram from an artist of an herb pflanze that I commissioned. This is the beet family. This is the ascending and descending that I'll show you. Where the moon is ascending, every evening it looks like it's going through, it looks like it's going through a higher orbit. And when it's descending, it looks like it's going through a lower orbit each time. When the moon is ascending, it's pulling the sap up into plants. When it's descending, it's going down into the earth. That is really important in terms of thinking of when you're going to transplant something. Maria Toon's northern transplanting time is all about this. You don't want to transplant your plants as the moon is pulling sap up into the leaves. If you plant them out, even if you plant them out in the evening of a day, but the moon is behaving wrong and it's pulling all the sap out of the roots up into the leaves, they'll dehydrate. Even if you thought it was mild, you thought you planted them out in the evening correctly. From your perspective, it should look like when you transplant that the moon is going down. Now, you can't always do this, obviously, but you can pay attention to this as much as you can. When the moon is going down, it's pulling the sap into the roots and stimulating root development. So you can really say, while the moon is ascending from your perspective, rising, it's going in the sky and it's getting higher and higher in its arc, just like we saw in the pattern of the sun, its character changes. Someone is asking, hold on, a question. Let me get that chat over here. Someone is asking, ascending and descending, do I mean dawn or morning? In this case, no, it's a technical term. And what it means is that from your perspective, if you were to compare yesterday where the moon was at its peak in the sky versus today, if it is going up each evening at midnight, so to speak, that is called ascending. And if it looks like it's getting lower and has a kind of a shorter arc in the sky each night, that is descending. And as the moon seems to be physically pivoting up into the air, it is amplifying the development of the upper half of plants. Whereas when it seems to be going down in the sky, it's having a tidal influence and pulling the sap down into the roots, stimulating root development. So if, for example, you want to use the biodynamic preparations, it's probably worth considering that, because if you want to stimulate root development and you want to use 500, it's probably a good idea to use it when the moon is descending. So you want to go down into the soil, the sap is being pulled into the soil, you'll get a much stronger effect then. If you do it on an earth sign and the moon is descending, that's even better. Some of this information is in the calendar. Not all of it is made perfectly clear because there's just so much context to it, but it is stated. And let me see, it may be at the very back. You'll see the ascending node, descending node. That's what it's changing direction. And those can be considered difficult moments. It's a bit like when Mercury goes in and out of retrograde. A lot of people don't like that time. Well, the moon has a similar kind of effect, so to speak, in plants. And so for me, the moon is the main thing. I mean, everything you're looking at in the calendar, all those pretty colors, that has to do with where the moon is. So even the official calendars agrees that the moon is the big thing. So there are really several aspects of the moon. There's the waxing and waning, whether visually it's forming an arc or descending. Then there's the rising or descending, the ascending or descending. And then finally after that, there's whether it's getting closer or going further away. Someone's asking if I can explain the differences between the different calendars. Tune versus the Stella Natura. If memory serves, and right now it's from memory, so don't hold me to this. One of the bigger differences between Tune and the Stella Natura is that Maria Tune adjusted the size of the zodiac signs based on her research. So for example, Tune, Virgo is really big. Whereas in Stella, I believe, they use equal 12 divisions. Some people, even within the biodynamic movement, have analyzed the data that Maria Tune presented and have come to the conclusion that it doesn't really justify changing the size of the zodiac in the sky. And I tend to be of the mind that it almost doesn't matter. And here's why: is when you get back to when you're germinating a seed, when that moment of germination occurs is not when you first put water on it. It's when that confluence occurs and that marriage of heaven and earth actually happens. For barley, it's overnight because it's just like that. For corn, it's a week or more. For parsnips, it's even longer. So when that moment is, I'm not as worried about it. It's much more fluid for me in terms of where the boundaries are. And Alex Podolinsky even goes so far as to make the case that you want to start your seeds before the sign where you want that imprint. So he took seeds and did experiments and found that there's this moment where the seed looks normal, then it begins to contract by his chromatograms, and then you see it receive a new imprint, and then it begins to be a new being. So he found that you had to do it at least 24 hours before you wanted the effect of that particular sign. Someone's asking, where's up and down of the moon in tune? I'll show you. Sorry, it's hard for me to see this. See this green bar? Wherever you see that green bar, which says NTT, or Northern Transplanting Time, that bar is your indicator that it is going down. That's a good transplanting time. This is the descending moon, that green bar. Now, if you're in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite period, if that makes sense. So if you're in the southern hemisphere, you'll actually be wanting to plant wherever the green bar is not, because it's opposite for you. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's one of the green bar, really important. The waxing and waning part, really important. Those are the most important aspects of the calendar, because we're going to work with the moon. That's again, like I said, again, that's partially my prejudice because of where I live and how I have to work it. But that's also some of what Steiner says about what we need to do with the plants. So we have waxing and waning. We have ascending and descending. But there's one more. Someone's asking a question to follow up about that. It says, but the green bar starts when the ascending moon node is shown. Let me see that. I'm not seeing what you are seeing. Hold on. It could also have a mistake there. That's a node where it's changing direction, if that makes sense. I don't have another calendar with me right here to compare to see if there's an error, but when you see those nodes, it's a change of direction or crossing the path of the sun, which is often what's happening with the moon when it changes direction. I don't pay too much attention to the nodes. If you know when it's ascending and descending, I don't worry about it, but there are people who would give you more indications that would be useful. Yeah, I've actually found some significant errors in multiple calendars. I'm not going to get into that, but it happens. Like, that's just human. And I'm probably making errors even when I'm trying to remember things. So I'm not going to hold it against anyone else if they won't hold it against me. Let's see. All right, so we've got ascending, descending, waxing and waning. And there's a third aspect of the moon that I want to get into. This is the perigee-apogee. This is whether the moon is really close or really far away. The perigee is the moon at its closest. The apogee is the moon at its furthest away. So as it comes closer, right to here, a supermoon tends to be around the perigee. When you get it at exact perigee, it's a really big moon. And then you can have a mini moon, which is super tiny. The full moon with the moon is really far away. So you have waxing, waning, you have ascending, descending, and then you have whether it's approaching, perigee, and apogee. And those are the three aspects of the moon, all of which taken together give you the total strength of the moon. If, for example, you have a waxing moon and it's almost full and it's descending, you're getting a lot of that energy coming together. The waxing is this ripening, full moon influence, but then because it's descending, it's pulling into the ground. But if that were happening at an apogee, when the moon is very far away, it gets muted a little bit. Whereas if it were happening and the moon was at the perigee, that's really loud. That's a supermoon. And at those points, sometimes the lunar influence is just too strong. And those are moments when you might want to use equisetum arvens. When you get the full moon, particularly supermoons, just in general, supermoons in general, horsetail. That's just, it's not a universal. It depends on your land. It depends on your soil. It depends on whether you've been getting a lot of water. But generally speaking, supermoons can benefit from an application of horsetail. Again, that's a generality. It is not a universal principle. It has to be adapted to the farm. And you'll know based on whether there's just been so much water. All right, let's see. There's one more quote I'd like to share. Then I'd like to take some questions. All right, this is from Steiner again. And he says, "It is not by accident that the zodiac is called the zodiac. It comes from the Greek word zoon, animal. It means it's the animal belt. If you want to achieve something in the plant world, you can stop at the planetary system. Whereas, he says, if you want to affect animals, you have to reach to the zodiac." This is something that is generally overlooked in the agriculture course, and I think that may be a mistake, because Steiner says if we really want to make a change in the plant world, all we need are the planets. Now, it doesn't mean that if you reach further and include the zodiac that you couldn't also get a stronger influence, but Steiner's own indications were that the planets were of primary importance when it comes to this. Stella Natura, someone's asking, says that the planting times are optimal for annual crops, and they emphasize it strongly. Someone asked, do you follow the calendar for planting perennials and trees? Well, that's an important question, because Steiner actually has a passage where he talks about whether you're planting conifers, which are ruled by Saturn. And he says it makes all the difference whether Saturn is rising or Saturn is descending, which is Saturn is the furthest, most outermost of the classical planets, whereas the moon is the closest and has the fastest orbit. You have a 28-day cycle, more or less, moon. You have a 28-year cycle, more or less, for Saturn. When the moon is rising, yeah, that's a good time to try to get things to germinate. When Saturn is rising, that may be a better time for managing conifers. And that's actually happening right now. I believe Malcolm Gardner sent out an alert with this information, and that I think all the planets right now are ascending. So it would be a good time to replant some conifers, or any kind of evergreen that's been dying out, like we know some have been. Perhaps hemlock. This would be a good time to restore those, if ever there was one. For the hardier evergreen perennial plants, you would focus on the aspects of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They're much bigger, they're much slower, but those impulses deal with the trees. So Steiner says also it makes all the difference whether you tend an oak under a particular aspect of Mars or not, which is traditionally oaks have been governed by Mars processes, though not in the biennial sense, but in the slower orbit sense. Now, I would like to take more questions if you have any, but I hope that answers the question about the annual crops versus the more perennials. The inner planets of Moon, Mercury, Venus have to do with reproduction, growth, and maintenance. It depends on what aspect you're looking for in terms of getting started in biodynamics. If you're looking on a garden scale or aspiring to become a farm, I recommend the works of Aaron Fried Pfeiffer and Maria Thun. Those are very good, solid introductory works. They're often well illustrated or have diagrams. Books for understanding the moon and sun characteristics. Maria Thun in particular. If you go to the Soil and Health Library, if you really want to get into it, you look up Maria Thun. There's a book there that I donated that I had scanned. It's out of print, but Maria Thun's results from the Biodynamic Sowing and Planting Calendar. And it's pretty intense. Like, you may not end up using it all, but it may convince you that this is something worth using. But when you see her results, because she got some very interesting products just by tending plants differently. I'm going to show some slides later that have pictures from her work. So the moon is the biggest thing, the moon and the sun. If you don't have those two things, it is almost pointless to look at the rest of that. I would, if I were you and you were starting on this, there's a whole side here, all this stuff that's very confusing and looks like, hieroglyphics. If it's boldened, you can see it to the naked eye. Most of it is not. So a lot of this is invisible. It's just what's happening astrologically, astronomically in the sky. Just pretend that's not there, because for me, that's not going to help a beginner get into it. It's much better to focus on the part that will have a more pronounced influence, namely the transplanting time, whether the moon is ascending or descending as it is in the green, or the different times when the moon is in a particular sign. You're going to see the strongest effect on annuals, yes, and particular annuals that will germinate within that time frame. So like this, for example, if you started something here, the moon moves from here, but then you get a root influence come in. Sometimes it happens due to a certain configuration of planets, and then it goes back to fire. So if you germinate something here, thinking you're going to do a tomato, it's going to get a root influence in the middle. So all of this is much more complicated. The blackout areas tend to be the ones where there's something unpleasant happening, often with Mercury. Again, people don't like Mercury in retrograde. Yeah, in general, you've got warming is the process that Saturn governs. But really, that's warming as a kind of secondary influence. You have to say really that it's breathing. And then Jupiter is warming. Mars comes nourishing. And you can almost see that the breathing leads to warming. You can say, breathing, you can breathe on a burger. It leads to metabolic warming, which leads to nourishing. Steiner doesn't mean it like that at all, but it's a helpful way to remember the word. Sun is secreting within the organism. And then you end up with the other three that I'd already listed. These processes all come together, and you can't have any living organism really without all of these, even if they're not fully internalized. It affects of a planet in retrograde. It's like the Doppler effect, that kind of thing. And you'll see pictures that Maria Thun shares of planting things when something's at retrograde or it's crossing the path of the sun. And they don't look great. They'll get twisted roots on each other. Sometimes those really cute pictures that you'll see in gardening groups of carrots twisted onto each other. It could be compacted soil, yes. That's the coarsest effect. But another thing could be a planet's changing direction in the sky. And you've got to think that is a massive body. And it has a huge magnetic field, all of which influences everything here on Earth. Like even our ice ages here on Earth are governed by the orbit of Saturn, of Jupiter. Jupiter is ginormous, and when it shifts, that is what tilts the axis of Earth, and we get another huge ice age. We already know the planetary bodies have that coarse influence on larger things. But when you end up getting to microscopic processes, particularly at germination, particularly at conception, at that moment, it still changes its form at its inception, the whole thing develops differently. Yeah, the moon is reproduction. Sorry, the other planets? Okay. Olive trees tend to be considered to be under the sun, generally. Let's see, Saturn. Yeah, the moon is reproduction, which is really enhanced growth. Okay. So if you think of it, there's growing, there's maintaining, and then there's another form of growth, which is growing another organism altogether. Mercury. There's some tricky stuff with this, but yeah, there's growth. Mercury and Venus get switched a lot in Steiner because they change names in history. That's too complicated for this, but you can just trust me, that's something he says. So the moon, Mercury, and Venus are processes that have entered into the Earth and have to come up, whereas Saturn, Steiner describes as warm air. It's these atmospheric influences pressing in on the plants directly. And he says that when you have problems like beet nematodes, it's when Saturn has entered the soil too deeply, which is to say, astral outer planet influence has entered the soil, burned up the humus, reduced it to dust of like a poorer ethericity, and it becomes more like forest soil in which grubs like to live, and then they attack your plants. If you can eliminate that outer planet influence, which is to say that warm air that came too far in, too much light got into the soil, too much warmth got into the soil, you could add more moon processes, organic matter, humus, manure. The grubs simply can't live there. Everything alive can only live within a very narrow bandwidth. And if you could change that, it can't live there. We can't live there if you change the oxygen a little, or if the temperature gets increased by a certain percentage. Someone's asking if any books that have a list of the planets and the plants that fall within. Maria Toon has some of that. I'm hesitant about ascribing plants to planets in that you can't really have any plant be alive unless all of the planets are working in that. Now, at the end of the day, yeah, there may be one that is more prominent than others, so that's why we could say something like conifers are ruled by Saturn, but they're all at work in them, because if they're not, it wouldn't be alive. It wouldn't be a living organism. You have to have them all working together in concert. So I'm hesitant about that. Someone's asking, do these processes affect germinating indoors or in a greenhouse, or primarily outdoors? That's a good question. And Aaron Fried Pfeiffer, who I've mentioned already, found that, yeah, there is a muted effect when you have an artificial climate. And towards that, he recommends spraying silicic acid, or 501, and 507, which is valerian, for greenhouses in particular, which opens them up a little more to improved photosynthesis, improved sensitivity to the universe, and brings, and also, if you're going to think in a practical, like market garden kind of perspective, silicic acid helps. It's antifungal, which is great for greenhouses. Someone's asking, would it affect transitioning from grow lamps indoors to outdoors for the proper moon cycle? Yeah, I would take that into careful consideration. In particular, if you're transplanting, if you're hardening off, that may not be quite as important. But if you're transplanting from this like incubator setting where plants tend to get, they're so pampered in a greenhouse, and yet it's often too damp, too much of a lunar influence in there. I would be very careful when transplanting them out. First, to harden them so that they have an experience of that external astrality, so they get something of a tougher skin. But I would pay attention that the moon is descending when transplanting them out, if that makes sense. I hope that does. Are there any other questions at this moment? Yearly crops are affected by the sun and inner planets, Moon, Mercury, Venus. Biennials are still affected by all of those, but add Mars. And then when you get to the other trees, they're still all affected. But once you get to the deciduous trees, you start to see more of an influence of Jupiter. And once you see some of the longer living conifers, evergreens, you see the influence of Saturn. These are things that can evergreens that can stay green year round. They clearly have a relationship to a special kind of breathing and are even able to internalize warmth that they don't shed the leaves. So you can see some of that influence there. Yearly crops are clearly affected by the sun, pronouncedly affected by the moon, whereas the outer planets tend to influence the longer living things. There's a book called, what is it? Influence of the Planets on Plants, which is a mistranslation, I think, of the German, which really says the language of plant forms, which is totally different. So if you pick up that book, you're going to be confused because it has nothing to do with the influence of the planets on plants. It has to do with the geometrical patterns that the plants have and the geometrical patterns that the planets seem to have from our perspective. There's a correspondence there, but they don't say there's a causal link. So the title is a mistranslation. It's very interesting, even very useful, but it doesn't explain that part. There are very different opinions about different planets and what plant belongs to which. So I'm hesitant to ascribe them because I'll say nobody really ends up agreeing. It depends on what you're classifying them as. If you're classifying nettles in terms of like its inner function and that Steiner says it belongs around the heart, you'd put it with the sun. But if you were to say that, oh, it's hostile and has these little spiny thorns and has a relationship with iron, then you would say Mars. There's a question about Leavigood's take on planets. I think that is way too complicated for the scope of this session. Again, good job, Mike. But I don't really use his. I'm not actually entirely convinced that he's correct about what Steiner's saying. I think it's a very interesting way to try to conceptualize the biodynamic preparations as having these various planetary aspects. I don't know that he was right. I think Steiner's layout of the biodynamic preparation better mirrors some of his medical lectures in which he lays out these various planetary processes and delivers them in a deliberate order. There's a stacking order to how he relates the preparations that corresponds directly to what he talks about in other lectures. For example, if you accept the fact that 500 might have a kind of earthy lunar influence, and that on the far end you see Valerian and Equisedum having some sort of Saturn influence, Steiner says when you move from Saturn down to the Earth, that is the process of incarnation. But if you move from the Moon back to Saturn, which I think the preparation list is, he says that is the movement into consciousness. So if you take that poetically or with a little license, you can even see that we're trying to bring consciousness to the Earth itself. I hope that obliquely answered your question by not answering it. Because that's a complicated subject. Someone's asking, would you say that the following the moon principles of planting are more important than considering weather conditions? No. I would say that your geology, climate, weather, all of that should be considered when you say moon. in the sense of if you've had a really wet winter followed by a really wet spring, that's been a lot of lunar influences. Steiner even goes so far as to say that when it's raining, that just is the absence of the sun. Rain is the absence of the sun. So that's clearly has a relationship to the earth and to the moon. So if you have a really wet winter followed by a really wet spring, you're going to have what Steiner calls excessive moon forces, which is when you use equisetum or vents to kind of neutralize that excessive lunar quality. Because if you have the soil's too wet, it's anaerobic, the plants get waterlogged, they're not able to evaporate. And what happens is the leaf layer up here, instead of being properly dried, so it's a nice leaf, it's too wet, it's too damp. And there's a soil level here, well, this one becomes another, and fungus can grow all over these. And that's when you use equisetum to try to have a kidney effect almost, of relieving the plant of excess water and allowing this fungal soil level to return back into the earth. Oh, the weather column of Maria too. That's a doozy. Yeah, she's got some very interesting aspects. So when you see these events happening on one side, there's all sorts of planetary confluences, special events. She spent her life correlating them and found that at certain times you would see storms or a higher increase of thunderstorms or earthquakes or various things like that. Sorry, equisetum 508. Some people don't call it by a number. I think it belongs in the full set. I haven't noticed too much of the storm effect, the weather effect in Maria Toon. It doesn't mean she's wrong, because you have to consider it geologically in terms of your region and your climate, and you have to consider it worldwide, because there may be a total influence around the earth that I'm just not seeing in my particular place. I also think there's a delay to a lot of these things. Like if the earth, if you're really humid, it takes a while for things to warm up, it takes a while for things to cool down. Whereas if you're dry, like in a desert climate, it can warm up very quickly and cool off very quickly. So there's almost a delayed reaction when you're in a humid area to some of the effects of this. It doesn't mean they're not happening. They just might seem to happen a day later. Someone's asking about using a sequential spray to reduce rain or influence more rain. I've tried it, and I honestly can't say that I've seen definitive results. Now, to get statistically significant results of that, you would have to do it so many times. Yeah, modern science is not going to accept something like that for a while, but I haven't seen direct results myself. That said, if you look at Stephen Buhner's work, Sacred, whatever, Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm, he talks about the origin of rain itself. The origin of rain itself isn't just a chemical reaction. In fact, there are certain microbes that live in the stratosphere that work as ice nucleating agents, and they're able to precipitate ice at 50 degrees instead of 32. So when you have a biologically active region, it's sending dust or into the air, for lack of a better word. It's sending microbes up into the air, and they act as the points of precipitation for ice. Ice always requires either cosmic dust or microbes, something to crystallize around, and it comes with the rain. Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm. It's a wonderful book. Highly recommended. It's excellent. Yes, so when it comes to the sequential spraying or not, if you are spraying in the morning, things are evaporating and going up into the stratosphere. And then in the evening, it comes down into the earth. And you do that repeatedly. It's like, I can see the idea of that helping precipitate or even alleviate water conditions, whether you want more or you want less. I can see it being possible. Now, have I seen the results myself? No, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. Hope that answers that. Are there any more questions at the moment, or do you want me to keep rolling? I'm going to continue. All right. So when it comes down to it, I like to think of the four elements in terms of a combustion reaction. Fire is obviously fire. It's a spark. Water is the fuel, or you can say gasoline if you have to think mechanically. Air is air, and light is the expansive pressure. You have a cloud, gas, and then earth is propulsion. And all of these work together. Earth, most notably, is a confluence of all of them together. You don't get propulsion unless all of those are working properly together. Earth, even humus, is this amalgam, this chaotic mess of every imaginable bit of every other plant. So many life forms converging into one spot. The earth element isn't really its own element. It's the leftovers of the reaction. The propulsion is the leftover of what that explosion caused. When you consider the calendar, I like this from Hesiod. Observe due measure, for right timing is in all things the most important factor. Yeah, we're missing an element in the Chinese, and those flow into various things. And I've seen an attempt to bridge the two, and it's pretty convincing. You could actually say that fruit and seed are not the same thing. In Goethe, they're certainly not the same thing. Goethe says that the seed is the contraction in the plant, whereas the fruit is the greatest expansion. Steiner says something similar. He says that the seed is this moon force from the root that's moved up, and bing, at the perfect level, it's still there, but only just. Too much, it will rot, just like the fungus from a wet winter, wet spring. Conversely, the fruit around it is the greatest expansion, which Steiner says comes from the outer planets, from that astrality, from the warm air, from everything that causes something to ripen and fill out. But yeah, there is the fifth element, which is, if you're thinking of the combustion reaction of the spark, fuel, the expansive pressure, and propulsion, it's that initiative to turn the key in the first place. And that would be the fifth element, or ether, or akasha, or the quintessence. Yeah, quintessence literally means the fifth element, or fifth essence. So knowing when to time things, or why the calendar would have an influence, this is back to if you're tending your plants. This is another diagram I rendered from Robert Flood. This is his depiction of chaos, which is, I think, a really nice picture. Chaos comes from the word, other way around. Gas comes from the word chaos. Gas is chaos. So whenever something is rendered into a gaseous state, where it's not fixed in form, it's not fluid anymore, it disobeys proper rules of fixed form, there's a liveliness to that. Whenever you disturb an established system, whether it's you're pruning your tomatoes, you're transplanting your tomatoes, you're hoeing around them, you're weeding around them, you're harvesting, all of that tending, you are entering into a new relationship with that plant. Whenever there's disturbance, it becomes sensitive to a new cosmic imprint. This can be your intention, which is undoubtedly important, but there's also what's happening throughout the entire cosmos. For example, if you're pruning your tomatoes and it's really damp out, and there's water on the leaves, and you're pulling off suckers, it's going to be more susceptible to disease then, even if it's the correct sign on the calendar, because they all have to be taken into consideration. You have to think not just of what the planets are out there in the sky, but what are the planets doing here on Earth? If, as Steiner says, that warm air is the Saturn working together with the sun, again, all of the planets are a reflection of the sun, then we can begin to learn how to work with the planets within the earthly realm. And again, if a rose on Earth is Venus, and the planet we see in the sky as the morning and evening star is another expression of the Venus process, then we can begin to see that there's stuff you can work with here on Earth that is working astronomically with the widest reaching effects, even to the actual physical planets that we know. It's really more complex than just a calendar. It's more complex than just the chemistry, but it takes everything into consideration. I'm always cautious about using the word holistic because I find almost invariably when someone starts using that, they've come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. I believe in it in principle of looking at things absolutely holistically, but usually the whole problem is irreducibly complex and requires attentiveness, sensitivity, and patience that no method can resolve, because your spot is unique to you and your relationship to it is going to be unlike everyone else's, and it's about developing that to its fullest expression. Whenever you stir and spray or introduce chaos, it's almost like invisible etheric supernovas that explode. Whenever that stirred water stops spinning, it releases that energy outwards and radiates that. Whenever you're disturbing something, all of those influences from the cosmos come and pervade it at that moment. When you send out the preparations, or you till and prepare a bed under an earth sign, you could do that. This is a better way to do it than thinking about the germinating. It's tending your beds. If you want to grow radishes, you should be prepping the bed on earth days. You should be tilling the bed on earth days. You should be working it, hoeing it on earth days, even before you want to plant anything. And then you already have a cumulative effect of earth coming into it, regardless of what day your onions or radishes actually germinate. If you see what I mean here, you're able to bring into the soil the influence of the cosmos, of the moon in its particular sign, by tending the bed in advance. How do you know it's an Earth day? If you look at the calendar, you will see root, wrong way, which is the brown one. Brown is a good color here because it's a confluence of all the colors. Sorry, there's earth, air, fire, and water. Earth is the brown one. Red is the fire. Blue is the water. And air is yellow. If that makes sense. The best time to do it might be when the moon is in an earth sign and the sun is in an earth sign. You get that double effect, because you have to think again, even if the moon, according to the calendar, is in a fire sign, but you have the sun at its peak and a water sign, you're still going to have an overarching kind of watery influence, even though it's muted because the two play together. I hope that helps. Yeah. When is the peak susceptibility for your baby plants? If you seed them, but they wait to germinate till the full moon, then you really need to pay attention to what exactly is happening around the upcoming full moon. Because if your seeds wait to germinate until then, well, you need to be aware of what's coming up on the horizon. Someone's asking, how do you know what sun sign it is on the calendar? If you look, there's a column that says solar and lunar aspects. I'll try to pull it up. There's where is it? Here. You look here, it'll be on this part, and then you're going to see what sign it's in. And a lot of this reads like gibberish until you know all the symbols. But there you see a little moon. It's sun. There's a sun, which is a circle with a dot, and something that looks like goat horns. That's Aries. And that's how you can know about that. That's very important because the moon's going to behave very differently if the sun is in Aries, even if, yeah, if you were to compare Aries moons in every single sun sign, they're not the same. They simply can't be. We have to pay attention because, as Johannes Kepler said, the soul of the newly born baby, and I'd say this applies also to seeds, is marked for life by the pattern of the stars at the moment it comes into the world, unconsciously remembers it, and remains sensitive to the return of configurations of a similar kind. This idea, from an astronomer no less, is the basis of the whole idea of a Saturn return. A Saturn return is when Saturn in your birth chart returns to where it was the moment you were born. So that usually is a difficult period. It's around 28, 29, somewhere in there. And it can be experienced as difficult when really it's part of growing up. You'll get another one when that time returns again. Someone's asking, is the decision of which sign a plant falls under subjective in some case? For example, echinacea is mainly grown for the root, but we also harvest the flower and leaves, and it's generally considered a flower. Yeah, some of this is going to come down to what aspect of the plant you primarily want to use. If you're tending something for oil content, you might focus on fire and air. You're tending something for more of the mineral content or the watery fleshy content, leaf day. The mineral salt content of it, root day. If you're primarily working for roots, you may tend it on root days. And in addition, if you're harvesting roots, that's something where you need to be sensitive to the sun and that ascending, descending. You want it when the moon is descending, but you can also do it when the sun is by our site descending. That's why we tend to harvest roots, after the whole year. You want to harvest roots also at the end of a day when the sap has moved down from the roots naturally, just within the cycle of a day. In the morning, the sap is up in the leaves, then it moves down to the roots. You want to harvest it when the sap is concentrated in the roots. The same is true within the year. There's a cosmic day of the year. And you want to do the same thing within the year. So you tend to harvest them towards the fall. Someone's asking about thoughts as an afternoon application to draw down sugars in autumn. Maria Thun did use 501 silicic acid as a way to enhance sugars within the roots of potatoes. I don't know whether that will do quite what you're asking. I can't tell. And my other question is, why would you want to draw down sugars in the autumn? Are you trying to reduce the total sugar content? Because if that's true, I don't know that silicic acid would do that. It does tend to increase sugar content, like in grapes that aren't producing well and they're not up to the sugar content. If you apply a late application of 501, you can get the sugar content increasing dramatically towards the end of the year. Yeah, the thing is with 501, it increases sugar content, but it also increases durability. So it's a complex question. But I hope that kind of addresses some of it at least. All right, I have a couple more slides I'd like to address if that's all right with you guys. Okay, here's some of the signs that people were asking about. There's warmth. Easier to see in fire. Warmth includes temperature of any spectrum, whether it's too cold or too hot. You have Aries, you've got Leo, you've got Sagittarius. You have light or air. And this is where you get Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. You have water, which is where you get Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio. You have earth, which is where you get Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. And for me, germinating plants, hold on. Yeah, when you tend plants on a warmth day, you're tending towards the development of fruit, that the ripening, nourishing part that resonates with warm weather, stuff like that. Oops. And when you do it on an air or light day, you're influencing the development of flowers or essential oils. on a water day of leafy growth and wateriness in general. And then Earth Day is the development of roots themselves, or any of the stemmy kind of stalky stuff, the lignin, the woody bits. But for me, all seeds begin as root, and that's why for me, as a working farm, I plant things regardless of what they might be. Like I might want a tomato, I might want a flower, I might want lettuce. I'll start them under a leaf if it's lettuce, but also if it's an Earth Day, that's kind of a wild card day for me because it is a confluence of all the elements together already. I'm okay with that. That's also how they begin. So I'm happy to start things on either of that. It also means there's way more that you can do on the calendar. Because if you look at this, and you're only able to plant fruit things on the fruit day, you can only do it on those red bars. But what if you can do it on the red and the brown? And you could say and the brown for all of it. That really makes the calendar considerably more dynamic within the context of a working farm, at least for me. Here's a good quote. This is from Alex Podolinsky's Biodynamic Agriculture Introductory Lectures, Volume 1, page 115. If these trials, Maria Thune's trials, had at first been conducted, say, in Holland, right near the sea, where the moon would have had more influence and been more overbearing, I think no one would have been able so readily to detect the influences, the effects on growth coming from the zodiac signs, even though they are mediated through the moon. And this gets back to me and where I am. I'm in a situation very similar to this hypothetical that Alex Podolinsky is positing. It's watery. I'm surrounded by the Chesapeake Bay to the west, the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and I'm at very low altitude, 32 feet. So I'm going to see an overbearing influence of the moon and far less of the outer planets. I need more of the outer planets, but I have to work primarily with the moon, which is part of I have to speak from my own experience, and that's why, for me, I have to talk about the moon the whole time. Someone asked if I take a day off on the grayed out days. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes I can't. It depends on the nature of it. Mercury days, if you see a little Mercury sign beside it, yeah, those seem to be weird. So those I'm more inclined not to do a ton on that one. Doesn't mean that I'll do nothing. I also think that if you are attuned to which planetary influence is at play, for example, if there's an occultation of Mars and you knew which preparation belonged to Mars, you would be able to apply that one and bring Mars to bear on Earth, even if it's, obscured in the sky. So I don't think there's really such a thing as blackout time. I think those are just more challenging times. But I think there's a correct answer to bring balance to that for anyone. All right, I have a couple pictures if you'd like to see while we wrap up. Here's a picture that Maria Thune shared in one of her books, and this shows the influence of harvesting onions on different days. The ones on the one marked AK is harvested with leaf, and then you see fruit. The one with root is the third from the left, and then on the right is flower. In terms of storage quality, she found that when you introduce this disturbance and take something out, that's what impulse is left there. So I do think there's a lot to be said for when you harvest, and particularly for storage and the planetary influences. Likewise, she saw the same kind of influence on carrots. You can see a lot of noise happening. There's just some unhappy stuff. One is sprayed with nettle manure, and then you see the good-looking one sown on a root day and not transplanted. Yeah, you can see just what a remarkable difference there is. Is there a BD treatment for peach leaf curl? I'm not quite getting into diseases in this one. There is an upcoming webinar that I'm doing with the BDA on, I think it's May 19th, which is going to get into pest and disease management. I'm also doing a 500 workshop on May 12th myself, which is on my website, perennialroots.com. But I am going to talk more about pest management. In terms of peach leaf curl, that's a much more complicated theme that I can get to at the moment. We're going to wrap up with 2 more slides here. This is an example of Maria Thun starting plums from seed. The same plum tree, and plums do not grow true to their parent stalk, planted under different planetary aspects. For example, the moon opposite Mars, look at this nice red. You get moon opposite Jupiter. Oh, look, you get yellow, which is the planetary color. And each has its own very particular aspect. And all she did is plant them under that aspect. Now, does that mean she germinated those days? The notes aren't as clear as they could be. But harvesting time effects, that is, those are very particular. And that's where you can find much better storage quality. Things are less likely to rot. That part really matters. And I think that is where biodynamics can really shine. Because biodynamics has most of its influence on living things that are currently living. The dormant seed, it's not quite active yet. Once it's activated, in that moment of activation, that's when the influence comes to bear. But when you harvest, tend, put away, that is when everything really does its influence. I'll wrap up with a quote from Paracelsus, who says, "If, however, there be anything wanting in your mode of working or your understanding, the planets and the stars of heaven will fail you in your work." Ultimately, it comes down to knowing your land, knowing the preparations, working with good compost, and all of that. The biodynamic preparations, together with the calendar, can lead you to even better yields. But ultimately, it's like if you use preparations on the calendar, but you don't bother trying to become a good gardener, it won't fix it. But working together, the two they resonate wonderfully. So I think that's it. If there are some wrapping up questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through. So I just want to say thank you, Stewart, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And I hope you will join us for the final session in this series of Microdynamics, which is this same time on May the 19th. And you can find more information on our website. So just a reminder, tomorrow I'll be sending out the video recording link and a quick survey so we can hear about your experience. And again, thank you all.